This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, hello everyone. Sorry we're a minute late jumping in. I think we'll actually probably take another 30 seconds or so to get started. We'll wait for people to come in from their previous meetings. So just bear with us for a second and then we'll be ready to jump in. In the meantime, welcome. All right, I see a lot of people coming in. This is great. Another 30 seconds or so, just to give some more time to people to jump in. You get to watch me drink coffee today. It's not my first. All right, let's go ahead and start. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is our webinar, Ask a General Counsel. We're gonna have a fireside chat around the topic of compliance. I'll do a brief introduction to our speakers today. Although she's not actually speaking, Tiana Totten, our content marketing manager, is helping us manage the logistical side of this webinar. So processing all of the questions that you want to submit through the Q&A window on your webinar. Thank you, Tiana. And our two primary speakers are John Carrion, General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer at Concord Career Colleges, as well as Jen DeMay, General Counsel at Unitech Learning. And I want to thank both of our panelists for joining us today. This webinar is all about your questions and what you want to know in order to better manage risk at your institutions. That may involve things like questions you have about changes to gainful employment or 90-10. It may involve other topics as well. And that's why we facilitated today's forum, so that you could get the perspectives of two other general counsels as they navigate similar challenges at their schools. And you can submit questions at any time via the questions box on your screen. But many of you have already submitted questions in advance, and we thank you for doing so. These are not scripted questions on our end. We actually don't have any. They are exactly what you wanted to know. And we're going to cover as many of those as we can. Before we do that, if you'll bear with me for just a few minutes, I promise it's just a few. I want to tell you just a little bit about CoreSki and how we think about compliance, and then the bulk of our time is going to be on this fireside chat. So Tiana, if you can advance to the next slide. So at CoreSki, we think about compliance across every step of the student journey, right? It's not a single product. It's not a single product or capability that's just one thing. It's really a philosophy or mindset, if you will, that underpins everything that we do. And some of those steps in the student journey are what you see here: attendance, the tracking of student skills and progress, handling student assessments and evaluation of skills, and then of course the final piece of it, having audit-ready reports at your fingertips. And I'll say a couple things about each of those things. Let's go to the next slide. So from the standpoint of attendance, the business question that we help you answer is, can I prove that students were where they needed to be, when they needed to be there, and for how long? This works across any modality, whether it's on campus, online, an externship, in another location. You can do multi-layered verification. So a QR code plus voice recognition, for example, gets around the issue of, potentially students sharing phones, for example. Keeps track of things like live attendance, last activity recorded. And by the way, this works not just for students, but instructors as well, making sure that classes are starting and ending when they should be. And all of this is done in an automated fashion. We've got a suite of integrations as well. So there's never any need to manually transfer information that you collect with CourseKey into some other system. Let's go to the next slide. We have a couple of screenshots of this. This would be an example of how a student might log that they are signing into a class via QR code, right? Using just their mobile device. Let's go to the next one. And then in terms of skills tracking, again, the business question that we're trying to help you answer is, are my students progressing towards graduation by learning the required skills on time? We enable you and your students to see this information in near real time. It's all done digitally, eliminating paper checklists and things like that. And one of the things that we found is that this served as a motivational tool for students as well. You know, we're going to talk about student retention in a little bit. And one of the things that we found with Skills Tracker is that it kept students motivated because they could see how close they were to graduation and how many skills they had already learned. So both a compliance benefit as well as a retention benefit there. Let's go to the next one. And again, this is an example of how an instructor or administrator could look at an entire class and see who is, you know, progressing, who may be falling behind a little bit and could benefit from some interventions to keep them on track, keep them motivated, and of course, keep them enrolled. Let's go to the next one. And again, a similar screenshot where students can make a submission around a particular required skill and the instructor can approve it or reject it, for example. Let's move on to evaluations. Again, what's the business question related to compliance, of course, that we're trying to help you answer? Can I streamline my quizzes, tests, other evaluations, and prove satisfactory academic performance? Our capabilities here include built-in ID verification to make sure that the student taking the quiz or test is actually that student, right? It supports multiple types of questions. You can time box things, do observational assessments. Let's take a look at that, Tiana, on the next slide. Again, just an example of that. Again, fully digitized, fully connected with your other systems. And let's go to the next one. And then finally, audit-ready reports, right? The business question being, can I auto-generate and auto-send properly formatted reports to regulators? We help you have proof of services delivered here, right? You know, there have been many conversations lately around, you know, borrower defense and some of the potential changes and updates taking place there. With this, you know, you're going to have all of that back-end data to be able to show that the student was actually there, that they did attend class, that they did receive all of the training that you said they received. And it's all sort of prepackaged for you. You know, as you heard me say earlier, these sorts of capabilities can keep track of what's required on the student side, but also the instructor side as well. We make it easy to filter around date range, class, campus, right? So it scales quite nicely, especially for some of the bigger institutions, and ultimately just saves time preparing for audits, right? And you can have confidence, of course, you know, in that data. Let's go to the next one. Again, just some sample reports here. This is a time attended report that shows students by location, right? Date of attendance, total minutes, got some other metrics, you know, there as well. Let's go to the next one. And one of the things that I've, you know, when I've used these slides in the past for other purposes, I've sort of talked about, can there be an upside to compliance, right? Because normally I think we can sometimes be hardwired to think about our downsides as a business, right? Risk, right? And making sure that we stay out of trouble. But by covering our bases in some of these different areas, whether it's attendance, evaluations, skills tracking, and so forth, it actually creates a number of tangential benefits for the institution at the same time. And I thought I'd say just a few things about that before we get into the Q&A. Tiana, can we go to the next slide? So the way that I'd like to think about this is for students who are at risk of dropping out of a program, and we know that virtually every institution worries about student retention. Long before the student drops out, you can see data indicators in other places. Attendance starts to fall off. The submission of homework tends to fall behind. Grades on quizzes and tests start to drop, right? And what we've been able to do at Korsky, really what our institutional partners have been able to do, is in the process of addressing or solving many of their compliance challenges in these different areas, attendance, skills tracking, and so forth, they've been able to find that they can improve student retention in the process, right? Because they streamline, for example, they streamline how attendance is collected and tracked. But it also enables them to get in front of attendance challenges before it becomes a retention risk for the student. And I like to say that again, only because I look at this as the upside of having a really streamlined, buttoned up compliance program. It can help you in each of these areas and ultimately help you retain more of your students in your programs, which of course has numerous benefits. Let's go to the next slide. And again, this is just an example of that. This is a particular student, Chelsea, and we're assessing this particular student's risk of dropping out of the program. And it's looking at these different indicators like attendance, lateness, academics, and so forth. So again, meta point here, just a good example of how improvements in compliance can actually drive the business in additional ways as well. Tiana, is that may actually be my last slide. So what I think we'll do next, we can jump out of the screen sharing mode and you can see everyone's faces here. And this is where we're actually going to begin the Q&A portion of this. Now, remember, you can submit questions at any time through the Q&A window on your screen. Where we're going to start, at least, is what was provided to us in advance in the run-up to today's webinar. Jen, John, thank you again. I'll let the two of you sort of work out, how you want to answer each of these. But the first question that we're going to start with, I think, is a good high-level general one, which is, in your words, what are the highest risks that an institution should assess for compliance?
Thanks, Adam. We appreciate it. Thanks, Tiana, for advancing the slides for Adam. So the three biggest issues that Jen and I talked about are documentation, HR in general, and then regulating admissions and marketing. So we're going to hit those three first. There's also a bonus question. Jen has a great analogy on protection versus burden that she's going to bring up. When she brings it up is up to her, but Jen's going to start out on the document retention aspects. And that's a big issue that we as GCs face constantly. And I faced it today with the litigation hold notice.
Absolutely. Thanks everyone for inviting me here. And I'm happy to talk to you. So my first thought is what keeps me up at night or the biggest risk for the school. Documentation. It touches all of the spectrum of areas. But the number one thing that we see is that documentation is generated by almost everybody in your organization, mostly digital now, but there's tons of it, and rarely have there been plans for how to retain it or how to manage it. And in many instances, that documentation is key to you either meeting compliance or demonstrating compliance to an external body or responding to a lawsuit or just generally being able to manage your business. Most of the good operational stuff is all on beautiful dashboards and terrific. The issues that come up are related to retaining documents you don't need, keeping them for too long, and then ultimately ending up with things that you have to either disclose or can't find that are pretty important. When we were talking about documentation, my first recommendation on how to quell your anxiety about it is to at least start looking at whether or not you have a record retention policy and a record retention program. And those policy and program are big words. It sounds very daunting, but in a lot of cases, what it just means is you need to get a plan together. Get a plan, start figuring it out. And you don't need to have a general counsel to do this. A lot of it is great committee work, but you need to figure out what documents you have, why you have them, and how long you want to keep them. And that will address things from BDR responses through investigations, through student complaints, into compliance and many other areas. So for me, documentation and where everything is and how I can get my hands on it quickly and make sure it's accurate is one of my biggest risks, my biggest concerns.
Hey, Jen, why don't you mention too, and I loved it when you discussed it the other day, the nomenclature of how you define your documents so that you can find them. One of the big things your team is working on.
So my organization is actually working on this, and I've worked at a couple of different schools, at nonprofits and for-profits, and I've never been at a place where it was already organized and great, because there's just so much. But the first thing that I have done in each of my organizations is kind of take an inventory, and what I normally find is people don't save things the same way, because people save it with the name they think makes sense right at the moment. But you really need to work on considering having agreed upon file systems and naming conventions, so that when you are looking for something, you can find it not because I thought it went with academic files and somebody else thought it went with admission files and you don't know where it is. But that's a really important aspect. And sometimes you just need to start with that at a department level and have everybody agree on what they're going to call it, and then make sure that that's the other thing, get people out of their email and into a shared file, whatever it may be. If you use Teams or you use a SharePoint or you use whatever, one of the big reasons people lose documents is your organization has it, but it's in somebody's email. And if that person leaves the organization or moves on, or there's some other reason you can't get to it, your organization is assumed to have it because someone sent it to them, and you can't find it because it's in Bob's email and he left in 2014. Now, obviously, the state asked you for it, the state expects you to have it, and the state sent it to someone. But for you to say, like, we don't have access to Bob's email is usually not the right answer. So getting people up and out of their email boxes for documents, not their communication, but their documents, and into shared folders and shared systems and servers is really important.
Fantastic. Now I'm going to jump in. We're just going to bounce back and forth a little bit, but on document retention, that's a huge issue that we've been trying to deal with. Jen mentioned BDR, which is borrower defense to repayment, was subject to the negotiated rulemaking last fall. We know that those rules currently are sitting in the Office of Management and Budget, which means that the Department of Ed could get released maybe by the end of this week at the earliest to issue that to everybody to comment upon. But document retention goes a long way to substantiating defenses to any of those claims. I don't know if this has been hitting a number of folks, but while we've been in this loan repayment pause, we have gotten a number of complaints from students back in the early 2000s. We had one back into the 1990s and a number from the 2000s into the early 2010s saying, I never authorized this loan. I did not pass the ATB test. We stopped accepting ATBs well over 10 years ago, probably almost 12, but those were claims. But we have had those records because we haven't had a formal record destruction policy. And that's what goes with retention too, is the schedule upon which you'll destroy documents. So that has saved our bacon on a number of times, just to say, here's Jen DeMay's ID for driver's license back from 2007. And we know this was the same person. And we've closed out probably about 60 of those complaints at a minimum and over the last year. And that has formed our quandary, and you all would be in a similar quandary. How far back do we want to keep documents now that the Department of Education is saying, well, they could go back into, those same time periods and you could make a claim for borrower defense to repayment and loan discharge. Everyone's going to face the same thing, and you need to decide what that is. At a minimum, we know from the department, you have to keep your transcripts and your ledger card permanently. That's what always means the biggest struggle than when going through those boxes. Something for smaller organizations, bigger organizations doesn't make a difference. We all know we have boxes someplace because we weren't always on digital documentation as we are now. So we got to go through those boxes, and no one wants to destroy them because no one wants to spend the time to look through. And do we have Adam's and Tiana's transcript and ledger card out of those files? Because to Jen's point, you wholesale destroy them, assuming that they weren't there, and then you can't find Adam or Tiana's documentation. It's not saying you are dead in the water with the department or the state agency that's asking for that, but you're in some trouble, and you could be fined, although that is yet to come to bear for most people, because generally they're saying they were destroyed by accident. But it is a conversation.
So one thing when people raise like, what's your biggest worry? And then they just lay it out there. I'm just worried about this. One thing I want to do is give you sort of a thing to think about that you could maybe address it if this is a worry for you too. In record retention, record destruction, it's overwhelming because most of your organizations have been around a long time, or even if they've been around a short time, they generate so much. Do not think about the picture in total, or you'll get so overwhelmed you won't do anything. Have a committee get together so multiple people have ownership to it. Don't leave it to one person in compliance or one person in marketing or whatever, and do 1 year forward and 1 year back, and 1 year forward and 1 year back, or 1 year forward and 2 years back. Like, take it in chunks. You didn't accrue all those documents overnight. You're not suddenly going to organize them all overnight. But if you don't do forward and back at the same time, you're never going to catch up. So it's also an investment that you do need to make. If you can budget a little bit of time, whether it's a person or a system, it's going to be well worth it in preventing, litigation or assisting you in response. The final thing is to keep really good inventories. You were just saying, John, I don't know what's at Iron Mountain, but it's probably like 3/4 of the universe is in Iron Mountain. And I don't know who's ever going to get back. When I first started 20 something years ago in the business, I used to pull records from Iron Mountain like weekly. We had someone who went and did that. We still have records at Iron Mountain for my organization, and no one has been there in 5 years. So we have a ton of stuff that we need to figure out what we have. And I'm sure most of you are like that. And that's not even counting the file drawers or the closets or the banker's boxes that are under everybody's desk. So they're there. Just think about that and make a plan for it and go forward and back at the same time so that you can actually tackle the problem.
And so one thing we did is we hit email for sure. Email is always the bane of everybody's existence, but we just put in a policy and we could tighten it up. But email's going back, it's on a rolling destruction now. We said we're not keeping email for current folks no longer than 7 years. And that seems like a long time, but the generally accepted period for keeping documents amongst the legal world is 7 years. So right now we're sitting at 7 years of email. So every month it gets swept. So we're going to be getting rid of May 2015 at the end of this month. The other thing that we did, and Jen made a good point, while Bob's email, and Bob's been gone and it's from 2015, we put in, and our IT department is really still not happy with me that we keep all terminated or employees who resign, we keep their email for 2 years. A lot of folks we've seen, and I've talked with other colleagues, a year, 30 days even, so long as it's not subject to a litigation hold. That is the big piece. We mentioned that if it's on a litigation hold, you cannot get rid of the email for those particular individuals. Something for you all to think about, as even if you're a smaller organization or you're even a bigger one that doesn't have a general counsel or a lawyer on staff. If you get a lawsuit from an employee or from a student, you're going to have a litigation hold that needs to issue, and your IT department is going to have to comply with that. And it's generally what everyone is looking for is, you hear in our trade, the smoking gun, right? The smoking gun's always sitting in email someplace because somebody said something that is going to be helpful, they believe, to their case. So those are some interesting points that we have on document retention. And we're going to hit these three at any point in time. Anyone wants to ask questions, obviously, you can feel free to put that in the question and answer section. The next one we're going to get to are HR issues. And a couple things there, at least from my side, was managing complaints, investigations, and faculty and student accommodation sort of go hand in hand. So the ADA aspects. But the HR issues we generally face are complaints by faculty. And so you have to take those seriously. Because Jen and I are both lawyers, it's presumed, everyone always assumes the phrase attorney-client privilege applies. Generally it does, but in-house lawyers are still subject to limitations on that and can be challenged. But when you don't have a lawyer on staff, if you go conduct an investigation, remember that anything you find is discoverable. If I ask people to do it on my behalf, I can protect those with privilege, or if I do it myself, I can protect that. But with no lawyer involved at all, everything is subject to discovery. So sometimes, go ahead, Jen. So you're going to make the point.
I was just going to say that one of my approaches to things is when in doubt, create a process. And usually process is a small P, so it's a way you normally do stuff. It's to standardize things. It's not capital P policy, which we'll talk about later, which you're bound to. But in a process, investigations, another investment is if you're going to spend any money on outside counsel, preventatively, right? So everybody has to engage counsel if you're sued or there's some sort of issue like that. But if you're going to think about each year where you're going to put preventative legal dollars, I would suggest that you invest in reaching out to a firm that is familiar with human resources issues and or student issues, and that you build an investigations manual. You help people understand what are good questions, what are bad questions, what are questions we cannot ask or should not ask, how to write things down. One of my favorite experiences that I had an institution, and we actually had a children's school associated with it. So I had kindergartners on campus on a jungle gym, and someone had an accident. And the person who wrote the accident report wrote in big letters, "Child found hanging by neck." Now, the child was perfectly fine, and he had flipped through a monkey bar kind of thing. But obviously, I gave that to the insurer, and their first answer was, "How big will the settlement check be?" And I said, "As big as you will help me write it." Because the issue is that person didn't know how to write that down. We did need to know the child had an accident, the child had flipped over the monkey bars, there was an abrasion on his neck. I mean, just a lot of things that could have been put in there. You don't want people to write inflammatory statements. You need to explain to people what's opinion versus what's fact. It's a really good investment if you help train people. And it doesn't have to be your lawyers. It doesn't have to be HR. It just has to be people who are going to be following the process and reporting all their information in a concise and thoughtful manner.
And those in the complaints piece of it too, Jen's right. Sometimes you just ask for outside counsel's help because it's good to have them on retainer when there's a complaint. Complaints come up of hostile work environment, sexual harassment, all these different aspects come up. And it's as an aside, but Title IX, right, can involve your employees. And we've had some claims, oh, the tutor inappropriately touched me while he touched my arm or touched my shoulder as we were getting trained. Those Title IX aspects definitely come in. So your Title IX manual and your Title IX processes come into play there. And that's where, again, to Jen's point, and we're lawyers, we've been lawyers for a long time. I still have a budget. I employ outside counsel because I know when judiciously to use it. And especially for HR, student claims, those are the two biggest areas that I spend money on with outside counsel. And it could even be for investigations of an HR issue that I bring them in because it's very sensitive.
Well, another part of that too, John, is when no matter what size the organization is, you usually don't have unlimited resources. And oftentimes, either legal or HR has already been involved with that employee. So you have to think about the conflict, right? It's rare that the employee who has a complaint or the employee who has an issue is somebody you've not heard of. It's the same with students. Most of you know that. You tend to get squeaky wheels and you tend to have involvement with them. It may not be prudent for you or HR to conduct the investigation, because what you don't want is to someone say that you were biased. Whether you were or not, it's going to be hard to prove that. So consider that. And if you're a small organization and you're saying, well, there's only one of me, yeah, that's the point in which you're going to have to make some decisions about, can't afford to send every one of them out, but you're maybe going to have to triage the situation. Like John said, we kind of have some buzzwords that we review and look at when someone has raised a complaint, and we put them in consider outside counsel because they either might have larger impact, they're not just about one person, or potentially they are something that is heavily litigated area. But that's a good thing. And before we move on to the other one, John, I want to touch back on what you said about accommodations.
Absolutely.
Because accommodations for employees and for students, it's been a big issue for everybody because of COVID. And I think people it's been very broad, and it's always a very difficult thing to tackle, but continuing to keep current with, particularly if you're in California or New York or Florida, some of those states have a lot of rules about approaches to leaves and things beyond just regular accommodations. Be mindful that process helps you there too. You just need to make sure that it's iterative and that you're communicating and that you document the communication. There's often not a clear right answer to accommodations. It is what works for everybody in the process, and that means you're going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's very worthwhile. One, because it usually means you get to retain really good students and employees who have a supplemental need. It also will enhance your ability to accommodate people in the future. Once you get a few, you'll get better and better at knowing what to do.
And I'll hit on those as well. And we still have a couple HR issues. We got a little bit of time, Jen. We're doing really well on timing. But on the student accommodations piece, one of the things that I've always done in my practice, I've handled them for the colleges, which I've worked for the last 16 years. And so one of the things that we have done is there was the debate around IEPs, or 504 plans. You might know that from your kids or of hearing about it from relatives. If you have an IEP or 504 plan from your high school, I generally have accepted those. You don't have to, but it's an easy way to support a claim for needs or accommodations related to a disability. Instead of saying to them, because our students generally don't have a ton of money to go out and get reevaluated and have another neuropsych test and see what they might need in their late 20s. If they have that, it's one way we have just supported their claims for accommodations. It makes it easy. Probably has you going a little bit overboard maybe, but it's very simple. It's one practice that I've implemented here that makes life a lot easier to handle. The other thing that has always troubled lots of folks, if you get somebody with a hearing impairment, especially when they ask for a sign language interpreter or note taker, you don't have the ability to say that that's not reasonable, because the language for whether it's faculty or students, is this a reasonable accommodation? Just because it will cost you $70,000 to have that sign language interpreter there when they're on campus and taking notes and interpreting what the instructor is saying, that is not a basis of cost to say that's unreasonable. So that's one thing just to remember if you're a smaller school or bigger school, because I've worked at mainly bigger schools and we've always had that debate. People have come, do I have to spend that amount of money? So two things, just real quick. I just want to say on the student side of it, one thing that we've implemented here I will say we have no student litigation currently pending against us, but we've taken our student complaints much more seriously at can we resolve them? We litigate the ones that we cannot accept or we can't come to some determination. But if you choose a path, and there are some school groups over the years that have chosen a path, they will fight most everything. That has not been a practice of mine. So when you're asking about tips from the GC, which was the second big one, and Jen and I are giving you those as we go along, I have chosen on behalf of our organization and got everyone here to agree that we will accept every student's complaint as true to the start, right? Don't dispute it, get it down, see what they're saying, and then we're going to investigate it and try to get to the bottom of it. And if you've made a mistake, admit it, figure out a resolution that's accommodating for both sides and get rid of it. Because the last thing you need, especially if you do currently have arbitration waivers or arbitration clauses or class action waivers, if those go away, you're going to be subject to a lot more litigation expenses and bigger claims. And that's why taking student complaints much more seriously and trying to get to the bottom of it, to Jen's point, of investigation.
So one thing that you'll note here is that we were asked a simple question: what are the 3 things that you're concerned about? And we have multi-part answers. So we kind of have a header and subheadings in this. I wanted to close out maybe in another actionable item regarding investigations and complaints is there are some fairly reasonably priced ways that you can have third-party online complaint systems. And I say that because the current one we employ is about $3,500 a year. And it allows you to have students and faculty, and we actually open it up to outside world, and we are able to collect them so that you know when they came in, you know who is assigned to respond to them, you can keep the notes for it, again, back to documentation. But most importantly, you can also get a feel for trends and understand what is the issues that are being presented repeatedly, especially if you have a situation where you're multi-campus and you're in a bunch of different locations and you're trying to standardize or normalize or be consistent in your responses. That's another place to look, is having a system that you accept them so that you're not just back in your email with a complaints email box, which can be difficult to manage.
There's a comment in the chat, Jen. Just look at it real quick so you see it. But the other thing that Jen had brought up the other day was faculty pay and credentials, right? We obviously have job descriptions trying to ensure that all of your people meet the credentials, because your accreditor will have issue otherwise. And the pay. So pay parity is a huge deal. Are women being paid the same as men for a comparable position? You hear that all the time. It could be a minority status that might be brought up. African Americans might be getting paid less than Hispanics or Caucasians. Those things come up and are definitely HR issues that we do see. And we try to take it very seriously to look at what is market, like, are they in range? Different things like that. That's where you definitely need the benefit and wisdom of a seasoned HR professional to do some of that, but those are things that can get you into trouble. If you have Bob making $100,000 and you're paying Susie 90 and they're in the exact same job and have the same amount of experience. But Jen, go ahead. So
I just wanted to comment. Thank you for the person who put in the comments. They mentioned that the nursing board doesn't accept IEPs or 504 plans. There's a lot of licensure bodies that are like that. You raise a good issue, is that we can accommodate you as an institution, and we can help you get the education. The licensure or test exam is another place you might need to have an accommodation. And then third and final is your employer will likely, if it's an ongoing, consistent issue. We often start counseling students at the beginning about those kind of things. And similarly, we do advise them to speak to the nursing board or whichever licensing board that they may be working with. My organization doesn't take IEPs or 504s. We use a different documentation system, but we do make sure that the student understands that we are one part of a multi-part process, and that education is only a portion of what they're going to need to get accommodations for. And we do try to connect them with the people that are going to issue those accommodations, at least at a testing level, because it is not helpful to have them complete a program and then not be able to have those kind of accommodations in order to begin their profession. So, and
John, just on that one real quick, just to say, because then we're going to get into the next one, which is admissions and marketing. Each state is different, and absolutely we do the same thing. We choose to do that. Most often those are our core students, meaning medical assistant and dental assistant. It's on occasion we do have some nurses, but each nursing board is different. And then we do have an obligation under the Americans with Disabilities Act as an education provider to adhere to it. So Jen's right. There are sometimes conflicts on what you may have to do. You can't just say, well, the board doesn't accept it, so we don't accept it. That could get you into hot water under the Americans with Disabilities Act, because they can file a complaint against you with the Office of Civil Rights up at the federal level. Go for it.
Okay, so our last of the three that keeps me up at night is really training. in admissions and marketing, right? So it's really training and make sure there's consistency in the admissions materials, because there's so many agencies that regulate this, right? There's consumer protection at the state level. There's our friends, the FTC. You know, there can be under BDR, Department of Education has a claim whether or not you were misled. You know, there's all sorts of entities and agencies that are regulating you. So the most important thing there is to make sure that you have well-documented training practices and protocols, that you are using them, and that you are consistently checking up. It can do all sorts of systems, whether you have a phone monitoring system, whether you have a sit in and listen system. It can be highly technologically advanced. It can be me in the room listening along with to hear how the interview or the financial aid engagement works. But the most important thing is making sure you know what your representatives are saying to the students. And because, one of the things I always say is it would be super easy to be a general counsel if I could just not have students and not have employees. I would be so good at my job. I would just be covering everything all day, because it's people who make choices independently that you end up having as the organization to be responsible for. So what you're trying to do is make sure that the people that work for you, with you, and work with the students have the right information and are consistently providing that. And then as far as marketing goes is review. You must have a multi-step process. Somebody in marketing, love my marketing friends, but nobody in marketing should be able to go straight to print, right? Because the best idea in marketing isn't the best idea in compliance, right? Those are binaries who should always work together, but like magnets will rarely come together, right? They're going to end up being in a general sphere and want to find the place in the middle where it's appealing and interesting and engaging for marketing, and it's accurate, clear, and direct in the compliance side of house. So for me, those are my issues with its training and review in the admissions and marketing area.
So from our perspective at Concord, ever since the GAO back in 2010, in 2011, it started recording on iPads. So they're called tour tabs, recording all of the interviews of students walking around and doing that. And even when the pandemic hit, we used Philosophy, and it could record, and it still does, records all of our voice interviews. It records everything, but we only review the interviews themselves. So we've chosen a path. It's a very belt and suspenders. And then we have a third party audit that about anywhere from 15 to 16% of those interviews every month. And everybody gets reviewed by that third party twice per month, so that we can try to ensure, to Jen's point, that folks are doing it right. Have we terminated people across time? Yes. One of the things that Concord has zero tolerance for is mentioning salaries during an interview, unless it's specifically sanctioned, like in Texas with the Texas Workforce Commission PS 005 document, or your BPPE student fact sheets, those things, then it's appropriate so long as you've been quoting it correctly. But if you just willy-nilly throw out, you can make anywhere from 50 to 70 grand, and we catch it because it's been caught by people just listening in, like Jen said, or on these tour tabs, zero tolerance. That salary information is also the subject of a current FTC sort of rulemaking, and where they're going to go. For-profit higher ed companies were specifically named, along with others, as to making claims, inappropriate claims about what you can earn when you graduate from one of our programs. So something definitely to be concerned about from the marketing side. So we definitely hold training calls for all of our admissions reps once a month, to try to ensure a heavy duty understanding of consequences, what can happen there. On the marketing side, we do have a process. It is reviewed by legal, but to Jen's point, our marketing folks are not allowed to go to print without talking to us first. Even the social media posts, a lot of things have been out on social media and what are required there, and the disclosures, the footnotes that even have to be in a thumbnail on a social media post are huge. And with the Federal Trade Commission, we were one of the 70 companies named. There were a lot of them. Jen, I think you guys were on it too. Yeah. It didn't matter on size, but the FTC put everybody on notice by that after naming 70 in specific, put everyone notice that they're coming after for marketing claims. If your marketing claims are too much, they're going to go after you. I think the other aspect of ensuring that your marketing materials are accurate and not making bigger claims goes to the borrower defense to repayment. I mean, everyone thought that that could only apply to closed schools. Well, DeVry just got hit. They're an existing school. Most all of you have heard of them. Just got hit for $87 million related to their claims about placement from a number of years ago. And they were forced as an existing school to figure out how to make payments of $87 million.
Well, and then a nice little bow to tie this. The things that we just talked about, both training and marketing, undergirding those are documentation. You can't just say you had the training. You need to document it. You need to have lists of people who were there, bring them pizza, do whatever you need to do, but make sure that they sit through the whole thing and then you document they were there. And then for marketing, it's called substantiation. You need, if you make a claim or you use some sort of superlative, we're the best, you better decide who told you were the best and what documentation that supports that. So those are also keys. So those are our kind of three big areas, I would say, that are risks that we see. I want to just note something about the couple things we talked about, and then I think Candace provided a great question into the next area we were going to talk about. But my bonus answer, or my bonus question for today that I provided for myself is about policy. And I talk about it a lot. I like policy, I like process, I like planning. I also like alliteration, clearly. But the issue is that policies only offer protection if you use them correctly. Otherwise, they are a burden. And my analogy is an umbrella. You can have a big, giant, beautiful golf umbrella that could fit 10 people underneath it. And if you carry it in your hand while it's raining, you're still going to get wet. You have the umbrella, it didn't actually do anything for you. And pointing out that you have the umbrella while you're soaking wet isn't all that comforting for anybody else. If you use the umbrella correctly, you can shelter yourself, you can stay dry, all that kind of stuff. Alternatively, if you use the policy incorrectly and you turn the umbrella upside down, you're going to be carrying a load of water for a long way that is a burden you don't need to. So when you do policies, which are very important because it keeps everybody on the same rules and regulations, one of the key factors is don't create a policy you can't follow, and don't create a policy you can't train people on, and make sure that you're always looking at your policies. Maybe once a year you have a policy review. That's another committee. I also like committees because I'm in education. So everybody to the table, it's always helpful. But that's one of the things I want to stress is that the answer isn't always a policy, especially if you know you can't actually manage that policy, or worse, that you're going to violate that policy, because a policy that has more exceptions than applications isn't a policy. So
100% agree on that. And just by way of example, we got cited, been around a number of different accreditors. Particular accreditor said, well, you said no food or drink in the lab, and somebody had a can of soda or something like that. They cited us for it because they said, that's your policy, you have to adhere to it. So some accreditors are much stricter on even simple things like that than you would even believe. So that was an accreditor, a big accreditor that lots of folks would know, but some of them have very strict interpretations. You say it, you must do it. Others might allow that a little slippage, remind you, hey, they said no sodas in here, get that out type thing.
So in our last 10 minutes, Candace has actually teed us up. She says, I'm new to compliance, but I have recently stepped into the role and all of the policies, needs, and process needs are new to me. Is there a repository of information out there that I can consult, or do you have resources to rely on? And our closing session or topic was tips when you don't have a GC or a chief of compliance, or I would tie in, or if you're brand new to the role. So one, Candace, congratulations. It's one of the best areas to work in. I love compliance and regulation. It's very rewarding when you get things right. So I'm sure it'll be a great career path for you. One of the things I would say is, depending on what institution you are. If you are not for profit or if you're for profit, first is get connected with one of the associations, whether it's CQ or NACUA. There's a ton of information there. That's what an association provides. Additionally, you can look for SHRM if you want to do HR information, and then SCCE, the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics, and they have an educational section. So associations are helpful for small organizations and big ones when you're trying to get the biggest bang for your dollar and have resources and model policies. You're not the first person who's ever had to create it. I know for sure NACUA, if you're a member as a nonprofit, they have I think it's probably 80 pages. It's every regulation that applies to schools, and it's a sortable function, and it can tell you where the citation is. It's not available to our friends in for-profit land, but there are a lot of great resources at CQ. And again, like I said, SHRM does a lot of those policies and procedures related to employment. And then I am a member of SCCE, Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics. They actually have a certification you can get, but more importantly, they have conferences. All of those agencies have conferences. So that is worth it just to go and absorb all of the information. Sometimes you come home scared and with a stack of things because you think I will never get through them. But in many cases, it's awareness that's the first help, right? You know that it's out there. Maybe you don't answer to it, but you figure out priority of the things that are concerns for your institution, because two institutions are the same. And the list that John and I just provided of things that we worry about, within that list and the subtext, we've each prioritized things differently, right? Because our organizations functions differently. They're in different geographical areas. We serve different kinds of students. We have different types of faculty. COVID threw us all a loop, but one of the things is keep aware and keep aware that you're not going to solve for it all. Compliance is not 100%. You're going for the best result you can, but in some cases, it might be better for you to tackle 2 or 3 things and get them really right than try to spread yourself too thin and do a bunch of things that are actually not effective or efficient.
So my comments to you, Candace, similar to Jen, I agree with you. Another organization is called CSPEN, CSPEN. They definitely have a lot of webinars associated at the federal level with federal compliance issues. But a lot of these they also have conferences at which lawyers and compliance folks will speak, and their presentations are out online. Aaron Lacey is at Thompson Coburn. He has a higher ed reg blog. I saw Brandon Sherman's out there. Maynard Cooper also does updates on education. So does Cooley. So does Fagery Drinker. So a lot of the higher ed regulatory firms have blogs that they put out or newsletters that will tell you about the basic issues that are out there. I think that the other aspect of it is when you're looking for policies, you can find, what might be a model Title IX policy sitting out on the web, right? There's a lot of stuff about Title IX that's been out there. Some associations, we can't vouch and say that that's perfect, but it's a good way to start. Or it might be a good way to start with the policy around marketing review or, just other processes. You can look that up, or accommodation reviews.
So websites are also super helpful. So Cornell Law actually has a dedicated resource for regulations, and it's easier to sort than the CFRs if you've never spent time in it, if you're not a lawyer, even if you are. Additionally, Catholic University has a huge section of policy and procedures. They're actually dedicated. It's actually a mission of theirs to support educational law. So they have a lot of models. I caution you away from just a true Google and saying, hey, I found this, but look for some resources. The second, I love what John said, is find a law firm or two in the subject matter areas that are most important to you, whether it's labor law, if you have, employees who are unionized, or you need student issues, or you just generally want higher ed. Find law firms. They do a great job of putting stuff together. Accountant firms are also a great place to go because they also apply. NACUBO is a good one, which is for nonprofits, but they let anyone listen, which is a great thing. And then a couple of the firms, Almic, Grant Thornton, those people put out a lot of circulars that are very helpful for regulations that might apply to you. My one caution is don't go overboard. Don't sign up for them all, because then you're overwhelmed. You don't read any of them. I'm just being honest. So one, look for the ones that say digest, because that means they sucked it all up and they put 2 sentences in each so that you can figure out which ones you need to follow. That's the most helpful. And then pick the areas that are key to you. So, for me, I don't get any tax profiles. I'm sure there's tons of tax laws that are out there that I could be following up on, but that's not, I can't follow it, because that's when I've decided I have an outside counsel I'll call if I have a tax question. I do spend a lot of time with HR. I do spend a lot of time with federal regulations. I do spend a lot of time with education. Those are the ones where, even for myself, 3 or 4 blogs is enough in a week to try to get through. And one thing that John didn't mention, and I'm hurt by, is your own colleagues, John. Sometimes you call each other and you say, most of the policies we're talking about usually have to be published, right? So how did you write this in your catalog? Why did you leave this sentence out? Why did you put this sentence in? Most of that stuff is available. And meet people at those conferences and through things and ask them, how did they do it? Because again, it's unlikely you're the first person to do it. Or if everybody has to do it all at the same time, you just want to be in the middle of the pack. You just want to do what most people are doing. Opposite of what your mom said is like, if everyone jumped off a bridge, would you jump off a bridge? In this situation, if everybody's doing something, it's better to be in the middle of the pack when something new comes out. Unless you're really super risk tolerant and you want to try something on the cutting edge, you kind of just want to find out what the middle's doing and see how new regulations or new laws apply, and then kind of develop it from there. So my suggestions are make friends, go to conferences, read a few blogs, and just put it down at the end of the day, because you also need to be fresh the next day. So whenever it's a crisis, whenever there's something, there's a point in which you are no longer productive for your organization or for yourself. Just remember, you can pick it up the next day. Unless, I once said that at a presentation and somebody said they worked in hospitals, and people really do die overnight, so I don't use that analogy anymore. But the actual thing is, you can come at it fresh tomorrow. You can probably create a better solution. So don't forget to take care of yourself and take time for yourself, because compliance can burn you out quickly, because mostly you get to see the problems. You don't get to see the solutions. And to that, I always go to graduation, because sometimes I only meet the students who don't get to graduation, and I forget all those people I helped along the way. So I enjoy going to graduation to remind myself that I did actually help a lot of students indirectly.
So the one last bit that I would advise Candace or anybody else who's new to it, you have policies already. You didn't step into it unless you're creating a brand new organization, and then it's totally different. But my assumption, Candace, is you're not. You already have your existing policies. You heard a lot of information here. That's where know what you have. To Jen's point, what's my inventory? Do I think I'm missing anything based upon what we said here today? Or when you look at some of those blogs or that Cornell.edu, and I agree with Jen, they definitely always come up when I'm doing a search. So those start with what you have, and then see where your holes might be from listening to this or talking to your colleagues. I affronted Jen because I didn't say I will call her and she calls me, which is totally true. We've known one another for well over 16 years. So that's where it is. But Adam, I think we're done on that note.
Thanks for inviting us. Sorry we didn't let you have a word in.
No, well, for anyone who's keeping track, we did actually get through about 7 or 8 questions all in one section there. So I think our entire audience appreciates that, as do I. So Jen and John, thank you for spending the last hour with us and with all of our attendees today. I hope everyone got something out of this. Again, we're happy to be able to facilitate a forum like this. If on an unrelated note, if we can answer any questions for the attendees about Corski and how we can at least help you manage one piece of your compliance challenge, let us know. We'd love the opportunity to show that to you as well. In the meantime, I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for having us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.